And now I've got the pleasure of introducing Tom Rogat. Tom is a clinical psychologist in private practice based in Beachwood, Ohio. His clinical expertise includes early trauma, personality structure, and relationship patterns. Tom has worked with the Adoption Triad members for almost 20 years and has presented numerous times on the topics of separation and adoption over the years, many times for Adoption Network Cleveland. Beyond individual therapy, he facilitates group therapy sessions focused on changing behavior and relationships, increasing self-esteem and self-acceptance. And with that, I give you Tom.
Thank you, Betsy. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. This is the first time that I've ever done this via Zoom, so bear with me as I kind of get the hang of going through something on Zoom. But it's really a pleasure and an honor, Betsy. So thank you. And it's always flattering to be asked to be here to help. So I appreciate it. So a real quick rundown on the agenda. Um, Based on past presentations, I'm really going to focus on significant other relationships. And I want everyone to keep in mind, though, that the dynamics that I talk about in the significant other relationships usually apply across the board to other kinds of relationships too. So whether they're colleagues at work or they're close friendships or relatives, dynamics usually are represented across the board. But during question and answers, please feel free to ask for any clarifications if anything pops up there. Um, I always try to emphasize for people too that they need to keep in mind that while we are focusing on adoption related variables, especially for adopted people who are in adulthood, there's a lifetime of other variables that come into play. So we always want to make sure that we're not hanging our hat just on one set of variables, because everyone else, everyone's got their own trail to get where they got to today. So we have to keep that in mind. Uh, as Betsy mentioned, I've been doing this for a while, so my lingo may be dated at times. So if I'm using language that you feel like is a little outdated, it's just because I'm outdated. And I hope no one takes offense if I use any terms that you prefer to hear something different. And this is an informal presentation, but with that said, please do try to hold questions toward the end of the session. I'm going to do my best to get through this in about 30 or 35 minutes to leave as much time as possible for questions. Because my experience has also been that as I try to hit the headlines, people really have a lot of questions that they like to dig into in more detail. So, all right, I'm going to just dive right in. So, in general, relationship patterns for adults are impacted really heavily by psychological factors, of course, but also by physiological factors. And that's much more new to the field of psychology over like the last 15 years or so. But it's really important as we talk about relationships now that we keep in mind how the physiology interacts with the psychology, because the two are really intricately connected. And when I see clients now, I never work in just the psychological realm. I always talk about what's going on in their body as well, and helping them understand what goes on in their body and how that overlaps with psychology. So we're going to look at things from both of those perspectives. But while I do that, I'm going to give kind of a briefer overview on the physiological side. And if there are questions, I can answer more during the Q&A. But most of the content that people tend to be most interested in is around the psychological factors. So when we talk about relationship patterns in adult adopted people, it's really important that we kind of look at the beginning of the relationship patterns that they're exposed to. And that's the early separation I hope everyone's okay with the term adoptee. It's just easier for me to say. But adoptees all start their life with a really early separation. I am also going to generalize to people who are adopted in the first 6 months of life or so. If anyone has questions about being adopted later, I can certainly address those during Q&A too. But having a separation when someone is an infant is very traumatic. And historically, separation wasn't really recognized as a traumatic event. When we talk about trauma in general, what we're really saying is that there's an experience that is that's whether it's real or perceived that activates the person's survival response. So they're in a situation that feels really dangerous to them, dangerous enough that it activates their fight or flight system. And separation from biological parents, whether mothers or fathers, is really traumatic for many adopted people. Not everybody's wired the same way, so it isn't experienced as traumatic by everybody, but for many adoptees, it is. And if someone has that wiring where they are affected by that trauma, they can develop a fight, flight, freeze, or submit response that's present the rest of their life until they recognize what's going on and make a concerted effort to change it. And those responses, um, they're designed to be helpful to try to help the person avoid future separations, which can be experienced as traumatic again. The problem is that once somebody's out of that initial experience, that defense mechanism really kind of becomes obsolete, especially as they mature into adulthood. Psychologically, adoptees can become preoccupied as they go into adulthood with unconsciously trying to understand why the separation occurred and also what they can do to ensure that it's not going to happen again. And we're going to look at each one of these in more detail, the physiological and the psychological. But that's kind of the core of where all this begins, is with recognizing that early separation is frequently traumatic for individuals. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the body's fear response. And I'm really going to kind of gloss over this. So if there are more questions, please feel free to chime in at the end. I'm sure everyone's probably familiar with the terms PTSD, and most of us have heard about PTSD when we're thinking about soldiers coming back from combat. But what we have picked up on in the field over the last 15 or 20 years is that everybody has the same type of system wired into our nervous system, that if we experience a situation as dangerous enough, it will hit our cortisol levels and our adrenaline levels where we go into a fight or flight mode. We used to think it was just fight or flight, that people would go into like this mode of when they're in danger. But we've also recognized now that people can go into a freeze mode or a submission mode. So those are kind of like the four basic strategies that the mind takes to protect the body when it's detecting a life-threatening situation. And what can happen then is if someone's wiring crosses that threshold and they experience a separation as traumatic as an infant, they can develop what is, I'm going to use the term loosely, post-traumatic stress response. It may not rise to the level of what we would describe as clinically significant PTSD, but frequently for adults who are adopted in infancy, there can be hallmarks and shadows of that trauma kind of imprinted into the nervous system that becomes a post-traumatic syndrome almost. And because we evolved to kind of have a better safe than sorry approach to survival, our brains end up erring on the side of caution. And what that kind of translates to is that if somebody who is affected by a separation like this is moving through their life and they run across any environment or any stimuli that resembles the initial danger at all, it can initiate that same fight or flight or freeze or submission response, just as if they're in that initial experience in the present moment. And what happens then is the body gets flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, and it actually creates a new traumatic state in the body. So whatever the current experience is can become its own standalone trauma. And the more that happens, the more that wiring kind of gets activated inside the brain, and the more neurons connect around those pathways. So there's a very real, tangible physiological aspect to the long-term consequences of any kind of trauma, but for this topic, obviously for traumatic separation. what I'm talking about right now, when somebody has this kind of syndrome, and people talk to me about, yeah, I know, X, Y, and Z makes me really anxious, but it overwhelms my body, or, I feel my heartbeat out of my chest, or my palms get really sweaty, or, I can't think straight. All of those are effects from the body interpreting a current situation as more dangerous than it is. And that's a sign that the reptilian part of your brain has kind of gone into that fight, flight, freeze, or submission mode. And that's what people experience usually as some form of anxiety, or for some people, it's also experienced as anger. But that's what creates those bodily sensations. Um, Psychologically, uh, adopted children, and I'm going to say children because this is when this begins, um, and this even begins kind of precognitively. So when an infant is adopted, their only experience so far has been with the person who carried them in utero. And as soon as they're separated from that caregiver, um, they know that the one person who's been safe to them is now gone. And to a newborn, and an infant, the world is really divided kind of into two states. There's safety and there's danger, and there's nothing in between. An infant either feels safe and protected and fed, or they feel like they're in danger and they're vulnerable. So when an infant is removed from its biological mother, um, they have a bodily experience of panic and confusion. We cognitively would kind of relate to it as an experience of like, what just happened to me? And then the other component that goes in is, why did it happen to me? So even though it's precognitive for a child of that age, that's still kind of the experience that they have, but it's felt inside the body, and the body remembers it in the muscles and in the nervous system rather than cognitively, as if like you might remember your seventh birthday. That's a cognitive memory, but your body carries memories too. Um, Kids are very egocentric for many years, as anyone who's a parent knows, and can sometimes be mystified by. And because kids are so egocentric, it really leaves them kind of with two common beliefs. Um, the first one is that if something has gone wrong, it must be because they've done something wrong. And the other explanation they come up with is, there must be something wrong with me. So either they feel like there's something wrong with them or something wrong with their behavior. Nancy Verrier, who wrote The Primal Wound, I think she has a quote that I'm going to read here that I just think like speaks so clearly to this. The quote says, "A mother wouldn't give away a good baby, therefore I must have been a bad baby." And that is the experience that we're talking about here. Of course, as everyone can, I'm sure, relate to, the way we view ourselves also has really important implications for how we view other people as well. We're going to get into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Okay, so beliefs and relationships. Beliefs and relationships, the way we view ourselves, the way we view ourselves in the world, the way we trust whether or not the world is safe, all of our perceptions of the world and ourselves and other people get formed when we're very young. It actually starts, the day someone is born, and it happens in the body. Do I feel safe? Therefore, the world is safe. When I'm hungry, does someone feed me? Then people can be trusted and the world is a safe place. All of these beliefs get internalized at a really young age when we're in infancy. They're not finalized in infancy. They continue to develop as long as our brains are developing, and they stay plastic to some extent, but our attachment patterns really kind of solidify during those first 5 or 6 years. But they start to get formed intensively in our infancy, but again, through more of a bodily experience than a cognitive experience. How this plays out later in relationships later in life is that we have a self-concept of ourselves, and we also have expectations of how others are going to perceive us. there's this kind of equation that generally flows throughout all of our relationships, which is we have beliefs and thoughts. Those beliefs and thoughts lead to feelings. Those feelings impact our behavior. Our behavior affects outcomes in our relationships. And the outcomes end up impacting our beliefs about ourselves and other people again. So it's a cycle here. And this is, you can already kind of see like this is how the way we feel about ourselves and the way that's influenced in infancy, that's how it can start affecting our relationships later in life, is because we have this equation that always goes through our attachments through our entire life. The tricky part is that until we are in adulthood, and only if we're making a concerted effort, our beliefs are frequently outside of our conscious awareness. Our self-concept is usually something that just feels like it's baked in and just part of who we are. Um, but they can be changed, and they are formed based on our experience, our early experience, going back to birth and through early childhood. The problem with this is that if the beliefs are not accurate, then the subsequent feelings and behavioral responses won't match up with the situation at hand. And that can be really confusing to other people that you're interacting with. And that can lead to undesirable or unintended outcomes in relationships. And this, by the way, this all applies to whether someone's adopted or not. But the outcomes that we get then often reinforce beliefs we have about ourselves. So if somebody has great self-esteem, they usually feel good about themselves, and that impacts the way they behave in relationships, and usually leads to relatively positive outcomes, which leaves them then again feeling, I have healthy relationships, I'm a good person, and that's why I'm having these good relationships. If someone has a negative self-concept, they can end up feeling anxious or depressed. That impacts their behavior. Other people will sense how they're feeling and they'll see the behavior, and that can lead to outcomes where other people might withdraw. Other people might notice there's an anxious attitude and back off. And then when the other people back off, that could lead someone to say, I knew it, there is something wrong with me, nobody wants to interact with me. And that can reinforce the feelings again, and the vicious cycle can start to get going. All right, so I want to address some of the most common beliefs that I've seen adult clients who are adopted bring to me over the years. And let's see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got about 8 or 9 of these. And for me, they're in these little columns. I'm going to read them out, and then I'm going to go over a lot of these in more detail. So these are um, generally in an order from what I've seen to be most relevant and most painful for people to least relevant and painful, but these are all big deals that people struggle with. So the first one is the belief that I am flawed, which leads to the belief that other people will see my flaws. I did something wrong, and the other people will see that I do bad things. I am not worth keeping, and the other person will not want to keep me. I'm not lovable, and if the other person sees the real me, they won't love me. I can be abandoned, and I can't trust the other person to stay. I owe you for saving me, which means I'm obligated to please you. I'm lucky you chose me. That makes me at your mercy. I am powerless, and the other person has all the power. I may not survive separation, and the other person doesn't need me to thrive. So these are some of the most common themes that I see as a therapist. These beliefs, these self-concepts, and the concepts of other people that grow out of that end up creating all kinds of dynamics that I've seen over and over again over the years. I'm going to go into some of these dynamics in a lot more detail. What I'm going to do is go through some of them, as many as we can. I won't get through all of them. I never do. So if you don't hear something that's resonating, please try and get it into the Q&As. I am also going to try to save a few minutes so I can talk about what the change process looks like, even though I won't get through all of these dynamics. So the belief that I am flawed usually has a feeling attached to it of shame. And shame is attached to this idea that there's something wrong with me versus guilt. Guilt is I have done something wrong. Shame is there's something wrong with me. The behavior that goes along with when someone feels shame is they try to hide who they are, or they try to change who they are to kind of deflect people away from what they feel is a flawed, shameful self. Um, One of the things that I see when this dynamic presents in my office is what I kind of call the chameleon effect. And that's where people try to change themselves to be the person that they think the significant other wants them to be. So if someone by nature is really serious, but they think that the significant other wants them to be funny, they try to start being funny and they kind of abandon their true self. So it's basically kind of like hiding their true personality and embracing a false personality to try to hide that part of them that they think the other person won't accept, that they fear is flawed. There's a very old famous analyst named Donald Winnicott. He was a child analyst in the early 30s, 1930s, and he kind of termed this, or he coined this term, the false self. And what he posited was basically that there is an authentic true self at the core of every individual. And if they are afraid of that core self not being accepted, they will create a layer on top of that that he calls the false self, um, which basically kind of serves as like a protective shell for that authentic self. And people can kind of put on a mask and a facade and present that facade to significant others so that if they get rejected, it's not their authentic self being rejected, it's the false self being rejected. So the advantage, that to the unconscious mind is, well, I wasn't actually rejected, it was my false self that was rejected. But the downside of that strategy is that um, the adopted person is never letting their significant other see who their true self is, which means they're never able to fully be loved. Um, the other thing that I've seen, actually, this pops up a lot at work for people, is if they develop a false self like that, it can leave people feeling like a fraud in the workplace and cause a lot of anxiety because there's a fear that someone's going to figure out that they don't really know what they're doing at work. Um, some alternatives to this behavior is identify what you might be doing for acceptance, what you might be doing um, to feel that other people will accept you, and just stop the behavior. You don't even have to replace it with anything. You just have to remove the behavior that's not helpful. The other part of this is getting to know your true self. When people develop a false self, they usually become self-alienated. And only by figuring out who somebody really is authentically and embracing that person, it's very hard to act in accordance with who you are and to love yourself, and therefore let someone else love you as well. When I work with adult adoptees, I usually tell them to start dating themselves. Don't go out with other people for a while. Just date yourself. Go and figure out who you are, what you like, what you're passionate about, what you're really repulsed by, what brings you a ton of joy, what you never want to spend time doing, to really get to know who that true self is. And then after you do that, take the risk and open up to someone else and let them see what's underneath that false self. Okay, the next belief is that I did something wrong. And the feeling that people usually struggle with there is guilt. And the behavior that I usually see around this is people pleasing. And by the way, you're going to hear me talk about behaviors that overlap a lot because all of these feelings and these dynamics, they tend to express themselves in very familiar ways across the different core feelings. So the behavior I usually see is people pleasing, and the thought there is if I please people, they're going to keep me around. So people can be and do what they think others want them to do. Sounds like the prior one too. Um, but this can really lead to focusing on other people's needs first, and maybe even exclusively paying attention to a significant other's needs at the expense of one's own needs. And this can create relationships that are really out of balance, where um, a relationship becomes all about one person pleasing the other person at their own expense. Some of the dynamics that I see frequently in these kinds of relationships is that um, the adult adopted person is not speaking their mind. Um, they can, because they don't speak their mind, because they want to please the other person, even if things are going really poorly, they don't speak up. And at some point, the other person might eventually kind of push them over the edge, and the adopted person can break up with them seemingly out of nowhere from the other person's perspective. It can feel like a real ambush. Um, Another thing that can happen also that I've seen in with adoptive families is because the adopted person wants to people please. Sometimes they will not question um, their own biological family for fear of upsetting the adoptive family. They don't want to appear disloyal. So even though they have a need to learn more about their biological roots, they want to please the adoptive family by not searching. And a lot of times they do that when the adoptive family would have been fine with them searching, but there's a fear that that could happen. This also overlaps, of course, with the false self and the chameleon effect that I spoke to a few minutes ago. And one of the tough things I think about this people pleasing dynamic is that in general, the closer the relationship is with somebody, the more risky it feels around losing that potential relationship. And what that can mean then is that the more important a relationship becomes, sometimes you will see people pleasing behaviors get amplified as a relationship goes on, which is kind of counterintuitive. Sometimes we think if we feel safer, we'll pull those behaviors back. But for a lot of adult adopted people, the more meaningful the relationship, the bigger the risk that there's going to be a traumatic separation. So some of these behaviors can amp up as the relationships go on over time. All right, I'm going to speed up a little bit, so I'm going to skip some of the stuff I have here. Um, the next belief is I am powerless. And the feeling with that is obviously just goes along with it is powerlessness. The behavior that I see in relationships is not recognizing one's own power in a relationship and letting other people really take control and dominate a relationship. Um, the way I've seen this dynamic over time, and this is one of the most popular ones that I see, is people really having a more passive stance in life and almost replaying what happened to them as an infant, which is essentially waiting for someone to come choose them, waiting for someone to select them, waiting for someone to approve of them, and taking the stance of, I hope I get included. I hope they choose me. Instead of saying, are the people I'm bringing into my life people who I choose to be with? Do I approve of them? Do they match the criteria that I'm looking for? That gets turned upside down as an infant. And that dynamic of passivity and waiting to be selected can play out all the way through adulthood if it goes unrecognized. This can also make people feel like a victim in relationships, um, that relationships are something that happen to them, that they don't have a lot of power in a relationship. Um, Instead of feeling that, hey, I've got just as much say as my significant other here, and I'm going to speak up to make sure my needs are being met. In extreme forms of this, I've seen people kind of get into a stance where they can actually feel like their role in life is to sacrifice their needs to take care of someone else's needs, which in some ways is like an unconscious reflection of an internalized belief as an infant that their role in life is to give up their needs in order to take care of the needs of the adoptive family. And that can also play out sometimes then in significant other relationships. And the real problem with this is that those people end up usually becoming very resentful because they've continued to subsume their own needs for someone else's. And over the years, that just builds up And if they're also mixing this in with people pleasing, they're not speaking their mind. And it becomes a recipe for disaster in relationships. Um, this other idea of being more passive in life versus having a more active stance in life, I've kind of talked to people about, um, there are two ways to move through life. Um, and I kind of related to, like, if you're inside of an aquarium, you could be a sea fan and just be kind of victim to the way the currents are moving inside the aquarium, or you could be, be the barracuda inside the aquarium who chooses where am I going and what am I going to eat, versus a sea fan who just has to wait for some food to come through the current and get what it can take. Alternative behaviors to this dynamic, deciding what you want ahead of time in relationships, but also in life in general, and actively going out and pursuing those things, waiting to instead of just waiting to see what comes your way. Having criteria for what you're looking for in a significant other relationship and making sure that people meet all of those criteria that are must-haves. A must-have criteria literally means it's got to be there. If it's not there, the relationship isn't going to meet your minimum threshold. So it's identifying that criteria and really sticking to it. Continuously asking yourself, am I being passive in a relationship? Am I speaking up and letting the other person know what my needs are? One of the ways we can tell if we are being passive is if we want to say something, but our body has a response that makes you nervous, or you notice you start fidgeting or your heart starts to beat. That's a sign that you're being passive because you're afraid of upsetting the other person. Um, okay, I'm gonna hit a really big idea here that I'm only going to get through one of my slides. I think I have like 10 of them. And this is one of the core beliefs for adoptees, which is I can be abandoned. The feeling is insecurity, usually anxiety. A lot of times there's anger. Um, this usually emanates in a lot of different kinds of dynamics. One of the ones, well, you know what? I'm gonna go into less detail and try to cover more of the dynamics. The dynamics that I see that tend to be related to I can be abandoned are picking someone who's not necessarily a good partner, but they feel safe. What that often looks like is picking someone who may kind of be a really poor match for what someone's looking for, but they feel like the other person would never leave them. So it's kind of trading safety um, for a good match. And that obviously can be a very destructive long-term pattern. Um, Someone I know asked about this in a note before the presentation, about provoking rejection in other people. This is one of the things that I see really frequently with adult adopted people in relationships, is testing the other person with really poor behavior to see if the other person's love is unconditional, to see if that person will stay. A lot of times this can play out as breaking up with someone and then getting back together. Um, but it creates this illusion of control over possible rejection. But the cost of it is provoking rejection, which most people, if they're looking to be in a healthy relationship, aren't going to accept. So by provoking rejection, it usually ends up leading to a broken relationship, or if it's not a broken relationship, it's a relationship that's no longer healthy. Um, okay, I'm going to hit one last one, and then we'll switch over to Q&A, which I kind of call like the first strike option, which is basically when somebody nitpicks a significant other with this idea that I'm going to reject my partner before they reject me. But to do that, they've got to find something that's wrong with the other partner. I see this a lot of times when someone's actually in a good relationship, and it's scary to them, and they don't believe that the other person's going to stick around for them. So they will start nitpicking things that really aren't that big a deal, but they'll start to get magnified, and they'll start to focus more and more on those things that are kind of nitpicky, to the point where they end up saying, you know what, this isn't going to work out. I'm going to break up with that person first. And a lot of times they find out after the relationship ends, the other person had no intention of ending the relationship. So I have a lot more dynamics around that, but I want to skip just for 1 minute to the change process. Um, because a lot of this can sound very overwhelming. And when people feel like they're caught in dynamics, it's really easy to feel like it's never going to change. And it's been this way my whole life. It's just who I am. And our self concepts and our concepts of the world and the people around us, while they get developed in our infancy and through our first 10 to 15 years, um, we can always change them. And to do that, we have to understand how we experience the world, not just psychologically, but also in our body, so we can understand when we are experiencing the world, when we are experiencing ourselves in a way that's not actually accurate to what's going on from an objective point of view. When we start to understand that, we can also help retrain our mind and our body to rewire themselves so that we only start to have a fear response when we are actually in danger versus in a situation that we perceive as dangerous because it reminds us of something from the past, but it's not actually dangerous anymore. Um, Usually that involves some self help books, but the most effective path that I've always seen is getting involved with an organization like Adoption Network, finding an individual therapist. And I also really highly recommend, if someone can find it, an interpersonal process group, which those interpersonal process groups are just focused on how people feel in relationship to one another and learning new behaviors. So that they can get different outcomes in their relationships and build satisfying relationships when the group is done. All right, so I'm going as fast as I can, but I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to hand it back over to Betsy.
You covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Tom.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, I think I confused people a little bit about the slides. So Tom has slides, but rather than having this be a real formal presentation with slides for you to read while you're listening, we will be sending out the slides afterwards. So I know, Tom, you didn't get to go into depth about everything you wanted to, but there's probably a little more information on the slides that you'll receive.
Yeah, there's a lot more.
Okay, good. Um, there haven't been a whole lot of questions in chat. I've got one, and I've got a couple questions that were posed during registration, so I'll start with those. If other people have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. So one person asked in an advanced question when she or he was registering, navigating relationships with grown children as an adoptee. So you talked a lot about partner relationships and even adoptive family relationships. What about adoptees as parents?
Yeah. So that's a great question. This is where the patterns that we end up developing in our childhood, um, relationship patterns, they get triggered at various times in our life. But usually when there's a certain stimuli that's present, that that triggers a response that was kind of conditioned when we were younger. So having children is a developmental phase that usually brings things up that have never been triggered before. So whatever those patterns are, they can present for a first time when someone has children. And as those children become grown themselves, you can pass into new developmental phases, or you can have new stimuli that get that trigger new responses that may have kind of been lying dormant there. So the real question here is to understand what's the emotional trigger, what's that feeling? Is it I don't matter to this person? Is it they're not listening to my needs? But understanding what emotions are thematic and continually coming up, that's kind of really where you want to go with somebody, regardless of whether or not they're grown children, young children, a good friend. There's an emotional trigger that gets the body activated. And that's kind of the clue that, okay, this is where I need to be paying attention to what's going on emotionally.
Yeah. Uh, so copying questions and
Yeah, that's fine.
at the same time. Um, Thanks for that. Can you talk about how the adoptee's grief relates to the birth mother's grief?
Yeah, so this is so grief is such a huge part of separation and adoption because all members of the triad are touched by grief somewhere along the way. Um, for for an adoptee that was separated as an infant, the body remembers what happened, but there's no cognitive memory of it. That's usually even true if someone's like, anything under 2.5, there's not going to be a cognitive memory. If there's a memory over 2.5, between like 2.5 and 4, it's going to be, just usually fleeting images only. So that grief is experienced in the body. And what happens then is when something resembles um, the grief eliciting situation, the body can go back into a grief response. Um, so it's much more of like a visceral, primitive experience for someone who's grieving that loss. And a lot of times they can't put words to it. There's just a raw emotion. And because it's precognitive, it's very difficult to put words to. For a biological mother or father, that loss is cognitive, and there's a tangible loss there that's experienced both cognitively and also in the body as a trauma. So they're grieved differently, and they're recognized as grief in a different manner. I think one of the things that's really familiar for both sets of people, though, is that other people often don't recognize that there's any grief there, or the grief is so underestimated by the people around them. So I think that's the similarity, but there's differences because of the way the body and the mind have developed before the losses.
Thank you. There was a comment that was shared. It's kind of more of a comment than a question, but I think it's got some value, so I'll share it with the commenter's permission. It was shared with me directly. That this person is currently in training to become a mental health therapist and uh, also about adoption trauma. And one of her goals, his or her goals, is to become an adoption informed counselor. With that said, this person says that they're 55 years old and is looking at how they can reconcile the onus that they have for quote unquote ruining all romantic relationships that they've had in their life. And feeling now as if they need to go back and tell people, I get it now, I get myself now, I'm sorry. And being able to, I guess, own up, feeling like they should apologize because they can't go back and fix anything. So
Mm-hmm.
I thought that's profound.
Yeah, that's when I work with people over time and they're learning more about themselves and their dynamics, that's actually a very not only typical but healthy response to have. Um, it's a reflection of the need for self-acceptance and self-forgiveness. Most, you know, obviously this is it's a generalization. Most people don't need us to go back and apologize, depending on the circumstances. Most people move on. Um, however, um, understanding what happened and forgiving oneself, there's a grief process in there because all those relationships they feel responsible for destroying, which by the way, every relationship in some way or another is 50-50. So it's not always on one person. Um, but there's grief there, that those are relationships that may have worked out but didn't or lost time. So you've also, in addition to self-forgiveness, there's got to be grief for all of those past relationships.
Mhm. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Can overachieving be a result of being an adoptee?
An overachiever?
Yeah, becoming an overachiever.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Perfectionism, overachievement, those are all ways um to to try to like ingratiate themselves, oneself to parents. If you're knocking it out of the park, you're going to get kept. No one's going to leave you if you're overachieving. So I see that dynamic, and I see a lot of obsessive compulsive personality traits also comes in relatively frequently because people are trying to be perfectionists to make sure that they don't get abandoned.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Betty Jean Lifton used to talk about the good adoptee and the bad adoptee.
Yeah,
So that kind of fits into that.
yeah.
So one comment that they would love to hear more about the about provoking rejection. Are people aware that they're even doing it? How does a partner respond? If you respond in a healthy way, boundaries, not having reciprocal drama, may make them feel more uncared for because the person doesn't bite to the provoking.
Mhm. So all of these dynamics are typically unconscious. It's very rare that any of these are conscious strategies. Our mind is so good at adapting to the environment that we're in and adapting to the environment we're in based on the environment we come from. So whatever patterns we bring into our relationships, somewhere along the way they were also influenced by, family of origin, teachers, close friends, people at school. All of that goes into the patterns we bring into relationships, and they're unconscious, and they were adaptive strategies that worked for whatever setting they were in at the time. They were the best alternative. Otherwise, our brain would have done something else. Um, so people don't usually realize what they're doing. They're doing exactly what they think is best, but that's all an unconscious process. Um, if someone's behaving in response to something that they're perceiving that the other person doesn't perceive, though, the other person is going to see their feelings and their behaviors as kind of out of sync with what's going on. So I think one way to kind of look at a potential partner is, can this person separate that out and give me that feedback in a way that's healthy? And can somebody grow over time in a way that they can hear that feedback to try to recalibrate their own self perceptions and understand that the other person is viewing them with an outside lens that is likely more objective. So I'm not sure if that addresses the question totally. If not, they can certainly follow up with another question.
Thanks. I think people are going to be having their partners watch this recording. Um, we have a participant who would like you to give more examples. I know you addressed this a little bit, but more examples about how to learn about your authentic self.
Okay. Um, so I'm a clinical psychologist, so I'm biased. I think the best way to learn about your authentic self is to sit down with a therapist and have them reflect back what they're seeing. And over time, a good therapist is going to help somebody discover who they are by exploring who they're bringing into the session. So when I work with people, my job is to help them understand who they are. And through discovering who they are, they get to decide what they want to keep, what they want to change, what they want to keep but only use it at certain times, and what they're never going to use ever. Um, but it's very hard to get to know oneself really well without an objective person there who, and when I say objective, I mean a therapist, because they're not a friend, they're not a partner, they're not a coworker, they're not a relative. Those people all have a vested interest in some way in that relationship. The therapist is an advocate, but neutral from the standpoint of they don't have to have the relationship have a specific outcome other than helping that person get to know themselves. Um, Short of that, I would say read a lot of books, hear other people's experiences because things will resonate naturally and other things won't resonate naturally. And that's a really good way to figure out who am I and what's making me tick.
Thank you. We have a question about strategies that a parent can take, an adoptive parent, I think, can take now for younger children. This person's child is preteen, when we see a lot of those beliefs and behaviors playing out.
Sorry, I dropped you for a second at the beginning.
I'm sorry, a lot of the beliefs and behaviors that you've been discussing, how can an adoptive parent of a preteen, what strategies can they use to address that in that stage?
Uh, um, if possible, therapy.
Mm.
Um, but if it's not possible, I think, well, is there a specific behavior? I need to be careful that I'm not giving therapy, but is there a specific example of a behavior? I think it's going to be easier for me to answer this.
There isn't one yet, but maybe she'll put one in
Okay.
chat. So while she's maybe typing,
Yeah.
we do have a couple of requests. One is to have a longer session on this,
Okay.
and another is for your contact information. So I'll let people know Tom and I discussed this before the sessions this evening. Tom's schedule is very full. And Adoption Network does maintain a list of therapists who specialize in these issues. Tom's on it, but he's almost always full. So if you're not able to find somebody, feel free to contact Adoption Network and we can help point you in the right direction.
Mhm.
Okay, so more detail on the issue this parent is seeing is people pleasing and being very passive.
Okay. Um, so the people pleasing and the passivity, I think what can be done here is rather than directly just addressing the behavior, it's going to the emotions that are underneath those kinds of behaviors. So if there's people pleasing, it's kind of going underneath that and saying, um, you know, I think it's sweet. This is just an example. It's sweet that you're concerned about what I want, but I'm really concerned about what makes you happy. And making sure that the emotional needs of the other person are met. So it's not just buying into, yeah, sure, people please with me, but paying attention to the other, to the child. It's through modeling that importance of their experience that the child is going to start to say, oh, my experience does matter because this is what mom and dad are making sure I'm paying attention to. So it's people pleasing. What was the other one?
Passive behavior.
Passive behavior. Okay. Um, it's so again, I would go to the underlying dynamic there, which is maybe not recognizing that person's power. So helping them recognize um, that is one choice is to do nothing. Another choice, though, which may get you where you want to be more, is to think about what you would like the outcome to look like versus letting someone else decide what that outcome looks like. So really encouraging the people or the person to recognize that they get a say in that. They don't have to just settle for whatever's kind of coming down the pike in their direction.
Thanks. Um, the last question we have so far, unless there's any others that pop in, is what books do you recommend around these issues?
Yeah. So this might be a surprising answer. For sure, Journey of the Adopted Self. Um, that still remains to me kind of like the best thing that I've ever seen. It's an oldie but a goodie. I think The Primal Wound is also excellent, an oldie but a goodie. But the other one that I would recommend people read is called The Body Keeps the Score. And that is a book that is focused on how the body holds and processes trauma. Because at the end of the day, what we are talking about tonight is a very specific form of trauma. So, and this is for the person who's becoming a mental health counselor too. Becoming adoption informed means becoming trauma informed. This is a flavor of trauma that has unique themes that carry throughout it. that when working with someone who's adopted, a clinician can keep an eye out for. However, it is a trauma, and our bodies and our minds get wired by the trauma. Um, so if someone really wants to understand what's going on in my body and learn that it's whatever is going on in their body is not only normal, but it's a sign of a healthy nervous system. Um, Reading The Body Keeps the Score is a really good place to start. So I would say if you're going to read 3 books, I would read those 3.
Thank you. We will send those names out with maybe a link on Amazon or wherever, so you can read a little bit more about those books in the email that we send to follow up with us.
Right.
One last question, and then I'll end with a couple of things. So this will be the last question. How much these types of behaviors are specific to an adoptee? I only know being adopted and moving through relationships as an adoptee. My non-adopted friends have similar beliefs, at least outwardly.
Yeah. So all of these behaviors can be present in anybody. And they can be present also in the dynamics of an adult adopted person and not necessarily be related to adoption. So, again, there's a lifetime of variables that impact our relationship patterns. Um, I've seen all of these relationship patterns emerge in other people who aren't adopted at various times. But this constellation tends to be the ones that I see most frequently with adopted adults, but by no means exclusive to adopted adults.
Thank you.
Yeah,
And that points to why something like The Body Keeps a Score, it's not specifically about adoption, but it encompasses a lot of this
yeah,
dynamic.
yeah. And again, that also goes back to my statement at the beginning that um, whether it's adoption or anything else, hanging everything on one hook is, it's typically not the whole story. You got to look at the gestalt of whatever someone's life is.
Yeah. Good. Thank you so much. So
Yeah,
much to cover in so little time.
yeah,
I agree with the person that said we should have a longer session on that. And we have done that many years ago with Tom, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to do that again in person would be really great too, if we can.
yeah.
So I put a link into chat that is just a really brief survey that people can fill out to let us know what you thought about the program this evening, and also to let us know about ideas coming up in the that you would have for programs in the future. I'm also putting a link to where you can find upcoming programs and a link to the recordings. I do want to call people's attention just because it came up in some ways even this evening. Next week we have Denise Labar, who's actually a massage therapist, and she's talking about issues in your tissues. And so how she's an adoptee as well, and how these types of issues get manifested in the body. So that's kind of a related topic to this. Um, I will put a link here to where you can find our other programs. I think as many of you are aware, Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization, and we provide lots of different types of programming for adoptees, birth parents, adoptive families, etc. Much of it is online, and you can check out our calendar and sign up for things that you're interested in. Some of it's in person as well if you're local. We're a small nonprofit, and we are a membership-based organization. We hope that you join to help us continue to be able to offer these types of programs. So thanks for that. And thank you very much, Tom, for volunteering your time this evening. And I can tell that our participants got a lot out of it. I know that I did. So it's really great to see you again.
Well, likewise, and thank you for having me. It's a joy to do it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good rest of your evening, everyone.